The weather is very nice. It's a little more fall-like than it is in Waco, Texas right now, where I'm told there are no autumns. It sounds like the title of a bad novel. No more autumns. They say there are 4 seasons in Texas. I just moved there from Virginia. They have almost summer, summer, still summer, and Christmas. So it's nice to be here to see a little bit of something like the autumn that I remember very fondly from my many years in Virginia, where I grew up and worked for many years as a professor of English at the University of Mary Washington in Fredericksburg. So I have some ideas I'd like to try out on you today, some things that have been on my mind. I want to tell you some stories about some of the things I have thought about, failed at, maybe a couple of things that have worked as well in my own experience as a faculty member, as someone who cares passionately about learning, cares passionately about my students' learning, and also cares very passionately about the ways in which information technologies can usefully augment the work that we do as teachers and as learners. So I've titled the talk, Cognition Prints. Cognition Prints is my latest metaphor. I'm a metaphor hound. Even that, of course, is a metaphor. So I can't do anything about it. The metaphors just spill right out. And this is the one that's going to, I hope, at least organize some of what I'm going to talk about today. I want to go through a few things with you, then have some time for Q&A at the end. And I hope that we have a chance over the next couple of days to be in conversation. If there's anything I can do to be of assistance, I'm happy to do that. And my stealth motive, of course, for being here, just as it always is wherever I go to speak, is that I'm sure I'm going to learn a lot from all of you as we go along. None of us has everything we need all on our own. It's the together thing that really does release the power of the network. So, how many of you know this book, John Bransford, How People Learn? Okay, it's available for free online. One of the most useful things about it being online, of course, is that you can search in it, and the search engine returns results in context, which I also find very helpful. So I've read parts of this, I've searched through parts of it, and have actually heard Bransford speak at the EDUCAUSE Learning Initiative in New Orleans many years ago. And he was talking about this book. This book is about the latest evidence we have, and even now it's a little bit out of date since it comes from the early part of this century. The evidence we have for how it is that people actually learn. What is it that people do when they learn? What is that like? And how can we, as expert learners, faculty, if that's who we are, or learners who are apprenticed to expert learners, students, how can we be more mindful about our learning to make it more effective? Because one of the things that makes us better as teachers and learners is to be mindful, intentional about what it is we do, to understand ourselves as learners. The way Bransford frames it is interesting to me because he talks about faculty understanding typical misconceptions in their students. That is to say, an effective teacher in the Bransford model is someone who knows the material well enough to be able to think about what parts are going to be hard to learn and what the mistakes look like as they begin to emerge so that you can catch them early before they become rehearsed, before they become entrenched mistakes. I think that's fine. I want to extend it a little bit and maybe be a little counterintuitive about it by thinking about how we can be mindful of learning so that we can see emerging conceptions, not just misconceptions, but those moments where our students are really on to something, where they're going down a path that could be fruitful, because the students won't necessarily know that, right? But we, as people who know the material we're trying to teach, should be able, by being mindful of ourselves as learners, to see when the learning is occurring, not just the mislearning. So I think about this, and I think about how in my own practice I've tried, mostly willy-nilly, by intuition, but lately, a little more mindfully, I hope, to figure out what's happening when my students start to get it, so that when I see those signs, I can encourage them. And this, of course, also assumes that I'm not always going to see those signs, that I need to be more expert at the telltale signs of understanding. That's the part that's a little counterintuitive, I think, but it's some of that that I want to explore today. And the metaphor, then, is that of cognition prints. where do we see evidence of mind in the work we do in a learning community? Where can we spot the mindfulness happening? I think that that's important. It's harder in many respects than to see where the mindlessness is happening. So let me think about that a little bit with you. It's important to have a theory of mind. Jerome Bruner talks about this as an elementary part of social organization. You actually begin to infer the interior life of another mind. And Bruner, because he's a very wise person, says that the first mind we begin to infer is our own. Sometimes that's called metacognition. That is, we become aware of our own awareness, and we tend to generalize from that to other people's awareness. And despite the postmodern move in literature studies, which I was a part of course, it turns out that our minds are more alike than they are different in the way our cognition operates. So there's some reliable inferences that can happen as we start to think about our own evidence of cognition. Where do we leave cognition prints? How do we communicate our own mindfulness? And the way in which we start to infer or spot these cognition prints coming from other minds. The other part of this is also from Jerome Bruner, that when you become aware of mindfulness, your own or someone else's, when you can spot those cognition prints, as I'm calling them, you begin to be intentional about the possibilities of minds working together. In a book called The Culture of Education, which was transformative for me, Bruner has a series of essays talking about the social aspects of education, and particularly what he calls the culture of education. Not just the sum total of all of our behaviors, but this cultural activity we call education. And he says, this really resonated with me, that in any school, the idea of school itself is always part of the subject matter. School considered as school is always something we're studying, whether we admit it or not, whether we're explicit about it or not, when we're in a learning community. And he talks about this as consciousness raising, about the possibilities of communal mental activity. But first you have to spot the mental activity. First you have to be able to dust for cognition prints. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, using Web 2.0 and not using Web 2.0, using some tools that didn't work as well, to dust for cognition prints, to be able to spot the mental activity, to be able to think about my learners' minds, to be able to think about my mind as a learner, and to be able to get to that consciousness raising about the possibilities of communal mental activity. And there are a couple of characteristics that it seems to me are useful to think about when you're dusting for cognition prints. And they're pretty easy. A lot of this stuff, it seems to me, is hiding in plain sight. One of the places you dust is simply attention. Where are people's eyeballs? Where are people's attentions being directed? What are they looking at? What are they thinking about? You don't have to infer intention. That's hard. You don't have to infer thought. That comes later. But what are people attending to? How can you spot their attention? This is not always obvious. Early on, when I became a faculty member, it was borne in upon me very vividly that the person at the back appearing to sleep may be having his or her life changed at that moment. The person down front, writing furiously, may never understand anything that I have said. The correlation is not perfect in either direction, but the point is, it's not always easy to see how attention is operating. One of my theses today is going to be that Web 2.0 gives us a rich trail of attention indicators, gives us places to dust for cognition prints.